What does rule by the people really mean? I mean, is it as simple as it sounds, or is it actually something way more intricate, something people have wrestled with for, well, millennia?
That's the big question, isn't it? It sounds so straightforward, rule by the people, but then you start asking, okay, how do the people rule? And who actually counts as the people? And what does ruling even look like in practice? Suddenly you're knee-deep in history, philosophy, complex stuff.
Absolutely. And peeling back those layers, that's exactly what we're setting out to do today in this deep dive. We're focusing on one specific, really foundational source, An Introduction to Political Theory by Oki Gaba. We're digging into the chapters where the text just meticulously unpacks the whole concept of democracy.
Right. Our mission really is to get past the buzzwords. We want to pull out the core ideas, the definitions GABA offers, understand the history behind it all, and importantly, grapple with the challenges that the text highlights. Persistent challenges.
Yeah, it's kind of like getting a crash course in political theory, but focused through the lens of this one specific text. A shortcut, maybe.
You could say that. And Galba's text takes us on quite a journey. We'll be looking at democracy from its ancient roots in Greece, tracing how it morphed into the modern liberal version we often think of today.
And tackling those tricky issues like representation in massive modern societies, right?
Mhm.
And how minorities fit in, what conditions are actually needed for it to even work.
Exactly. And then there's this deeper idea. The source explores democracy not just as a system of government, but as a whole way of life. It's a really comprehensive look.
Okay, well, let's jump right in. Where does the source start us off? The classical view.
Perfect starting point. The text begins, logically enough, with the word itself. Greek roots, demos, meaning the people, and kratos, meaning rule or government. So literally right there in the language, it's rule of the people.
Simple enough. And the source brings up that famous Lincoln quote, too.
It does. Abraham Lincoln's government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It captures that core idea, doesn't it? That the people are the ultimate authority, they're the ones doing the governing somehow, and it's all meant to serve their interests.
But this wasn't just abstract theory back then. The source points to actual places where they tried to make it work.
Right, ancient Greece. The city-states, specifically Athens, are the main examples the text uses. And it lays out some key features of how it worked there, or at least how it was supposed to work.
Okay, like what?
Well, first off, this idea of equal participation. All freemen, and that's an important distinction, not everyone were expected to take part in the common affairs of the polis, the city-state.
And this wasn't just seen as a duty.
No, interestingly, it was considered essential for living a good, fulfilling life. Being involved in the community's decisions was part of human flourishing.
Wow, okay. So civic engagement is self-fulfillment. What else?
Second, big decisions weren't just handed down. They were meant to be made through free and open discussion among these citizens. The belief was that debate would lead to wiser choices.
Makes sense. Dialogue leading to better outcomes.
And third, there is a really strong emphasis on respecting the law and established procedures. This wasn't arbitrary rule by whim. It was rule within a framework of law. They saw this as fundamentally different from what they called the arbitrary rule of non-Greek societies, the barbarians.
So active citizens, discussion, rule of law. Sounds pretty good on paper, but the source quickly points out it wasn't universally loved, even back then.
Not at all. And this is crucial. Some of the biggest names in ancient philosophy were actually deeply critical of democracy. Plato, for example.
Right, Plato. What was his problem with it?
His main issue was competence. He fundamentally believed that the common people just didn't have the necessary education or wisdom to choose good leaders or make sound judgments about running a state.
He thought letting the masses decide was asking for trouble.
Pretty much. He argued it empowered people who were good at speaking, maybe charming or persuasive, but who were ultimately selfish or incompetent. And these people, in his view, would inevitably ruin the state. He feared it would lead to chaos and bad decisions.
A pretty stark warning about the potential dangers of popular rule if the population isn't, well, prepared for it.
Definitely. Then you have Aristotle. His take was a bit more nuanced, but still critical. He famously classified governments and he defined democracy as the rule of the many.
And the many usually meant.
Generally, the poorer, less educated majority in the city-state. And importantly, in his classification system, he labeled democracy a perverted form of government.
Perverted. Why perverted?
Because he believed it served the interests of only one part of the state, the poor majority, rather than the common good of the entire state. His ideal was polity, a kind of mixed government. For Aristotle, pure democracy risked instability and injustice because the ruling group was pursuing its own narrow interests.
Okay, so another critique focused on self-interest and potential instability. But didn't Aristotle also see some advantages? The source mentions that.
Yes, and this is fascinating. Even while calling it perverted, he acknowledged some potential strengths. He argued that while any single individual from the masses might not be very knowledgeable, collectively, the people could actually be pretty good judges.
How so?
The source uses his analogies, like the person who lives in a house is a better judge of whether it's a good house than the builder who constructed it. Or the guest at a feast is a better judge of the food than the cook who prepared it.
Ah, the wisdom of the user, the wisdom of the crowd, kind of.
Exactly. It's the idea that the collective experience of the many gives them a kind of practical wisdom about the results of government that even experts might miss. It's a really powerful counterargument, isn't it?
It really is. That feels very relevant today.
Yeah.
But Aristotle still had reservations, right? Major ones.
Oh, yes. He listed several demerits. He thought democracy was built on a false idea of equality, assuming that because people are equal in one way, like being citizens, they must be equal in all ways, including political judgment.
Which meant ignoring real differences in, say, virtue or competence.
That was his point. He felt democracy sacrificed ability to sheer numbers, and he worried those numbers could be easily manipulated by clever rhetoric or trickery. He saw the populace as potentially fickle, easily misled.
Which led him to suggest something pretty undemocratic.
Right, he actually suggested limiting voting rights to the more intelligent citizens, which obviously cuts against the core idea of broad participation.
So his solution wasn't pure democracy.
No. Ultimately, Aristotle favored a mixed constitution, something that blended elements of aristocracy rule by the best, the virtuous elite, with elements of democracy rule by the many. He thought this mix offered the best chance for stability and good government.
So even at the very beginning, you see this tension between the ideal of popular rule and deep skepticism about its practicality and wisdom.
Precisely. And this classical focus on democracy, primarily as a form of government, a set of procedures, is something the source notes echoed much later in the work of modern thinkers like A.V. Dicey and James Bryce.
Okay, Dicey first. How did he fit into this classical view?
Dicey, writing about England, really focused on the relationship between law and public opinion. He saw democracy as a system where, ultimately, the opinion of the majority shapes legislation. He argued it was basically unwise, even impossible, for a democratic government to try and enforce laws that went strongly against the grain of popular feeling.
So for him, the mechanics of government had to align with majority sentiment.
That was key. Then there's James Bryce, a hugely influential figure, especially for his study of American democracy. The source portrays him as both a big supporter of democracy, but also a very perceptive critic.
He saw both sides clearly.
Very much so. In his major works, he defined democracy essentially as the rule of the people expressing their sovereign will through the votes. But the source points out that, in practice, this boiled down to the rule of the majority via elections.
And how did he justify this system? Was it inherently the best in his view?
Not necessarily the best in some abstract sense, but the best available, perhaps. His justification was pragmatic. He judged governments based on how well they looked after the welfare of the people and performed essential functions, protection, justice, administration, helping citizens. He argued democracies do these things at least as well as other forms of government.
So it's not that they're magically better at the basics, but they're not worse either.
Right. Competent, basically. But Bryce did see one additional benefit that he thought was unique to democracy.
Which was?
He believed that the very act of participation in a democracy, voting, engaging with public issues, actually helps educate citizens and broaden their interests. It develops their character, makes them more capable.
Ah, so participation itself is a good thing for the citizen's own development. That echoes the ancient Greek idea a bit, but maybe more focused on intellectual growth.
I think that's a fair comparison. For Bryce, it wasn't necessarily about people directly making every decision, but the process of being involved was crucial. He saw people exercising their authority by setting the broad goals for government and by keeping an eye on the administrators.
But he wasn't naive. He knew it wasn't perfect. The source mentions his limitations.
Absolutely. He was clear. Democracy wasn't some magic bullet. It hadn't ended war or corruption. But comparing it to historical alternatives like monarchies or oligarchies, he concluded it still provided better government overall. It was an improvement on the past.
What specific problems, or evils, as the source calls them, did Bryce identify?
He listed 6 main ones. First, the influence of wealthy interests. Second, politics becoming a job just for personal gain. Third, government extravagance. Fourth, a tendency to undervalue expertise and misuse the idea of equality. Fifth, the negative side of party politics. And sixth, politicians constantly playing for votes instead of focusing on good policy.
That list sounds depressingly familiar.
Doesn't it? But Bryce made a distinction. He argued the first three, money power, politics for gain, extravagance, were common problems found in many types of government, not just democracies. The last three, ignoring skill, party strife, playing for votes, he felt were more specific to democracy, but crucially, he believed they could be overcome. They weren't fatal flaws.
He didn't think democracy was inherently more evil, just channeled it differently.
That's a good way to put it. And he saw ways to fight back. Law was one weapon, but he saw public opinion as a unique democratic safeguard, a force that could hold power accountable. He also recognized new challenges like urbanization and large labor groups.
And what did he think the future depended on?
Ultimately, human wisdom, which led to his famous quote, the one that sums it all up. No other government gives to the citizen as does a democracy. At the same time, no other government demands so much.
Demands so much. That really sticks. It puts the onus back on the citizens.
It absolutely does. Now, the source does offer a critique of Bryce, suggesting he might have underestimated some deeper social factors, like the rise of organized groups and industrial democracy concepts. But still, he's presented as a key figure shaping that classical view of democracy as primarily a functioning system of government.
Okay, so that covers the classical perspective, viewing democracy mainly as a governmental structure. But the source makes it clear the concept evolved, right?
Right.
Especially with the rise of liberalism.
Yes, this is a major shift the source explores. Today, when we say democracy, we often implicitly mean liberal democracy. But the text points out something interesting. Liberalism, as a philosophy, is actually older than widespread democracy. And historically, they weren't always allies.
How so? The source mentions a paradox here.
Exactly. Drawing on C.B. Macpherson, the text highlights that for a long time, much of liberal thought and the actual liberal states that emerged were quite anti-democratic.
Really?
Because classical liberalism was heavily focused on individual rights, especially the right to acquire unlimited property within a capitalist market system, this focus inherently accepted, even required, significant inequality, both economic and political.
Which translated into things like property requirements to vote.
Precisely. That was common practice. Only those who owned a certain amount of property were deemed fit to participate politically, which, of course, directly contradicts the democratic ideal of equality and everyone having a voice.
So how did these two seemingly opposed ideas, inequality accepting liberalism and equality-based democracy, get merged together?
The source suggests it wasn't really a smooth philosophical blend, but more of a historical necessity, driven by huge social changes. Capitalism and the free market led to industrialization, urbanization.
Creating this massive new working class.
Exactly. Concentrated in cities, often in terrible conditions, this working class gradually became aware of its numbers and potential power. And they started demanding rights, especially the right to vote.
Putting pressure on the existing liberal states.
Huge pressure. The source argues that the liberal state, which had been focused on protecting property and maintaining order with limited suffrage, basically had to adapt to survive. It had to accommodate democratic demands like universal suffrage to manage social conflict and maintain stability.
So liberal democracy emerged as a kind of compromise, a way to reconcile the free market with mass political demands.
That's the interpretation offered. Liberal democracy equals the free market plus universal adult franchise. It was an attempt, often through gradual reforms and the development of the welfare state, to manage the inherent tensions between capital and labor.
Okay, so this hybrid liberal democracy, according to the source, rests on certain core principles and relies on specific mechanisms to work. Principles first.
Right. The source lays out 5 key principles: government by consent, public accountability, majority rule, recognition of minority rights, and constitutional government.
Let's take them one by one. Government by consent. Seems obvious for democracy.
It is fundamental. But the source adds a crucial condition. Consent has to be rational, and rational consent requires free and open discussion. So any regime that claims consent but stifles free expression, even if it has elections, isn't truly democratic in this view.
So free speech isn't just nice to have, it's foundational to the whole idea of consent.
Absolutely essential. You can't rationally consent if you can't freely discuss the options. Now, obviously, you can't consult everyone on every tiny detail, but discussion on the big issues is vital. The source mentions this happens in legislatures, with opposition voices, and also in the wider public sphere media, communication between leaders and people.
And the need for leaders to get reelected keeps them somewhat tied to that public discussion.
Hopefully. Which leads directly to the second principle, public accountability. If the government derives its power from the people's consent, it must be answerable to them.
The source brings in some big names here.
Yeah.
Locke.
Yes, John Locke's idea of government as a trustee holding power for the people. But Locke warned, you can't just trust them blindly, you need constant vigilance. The source uses his analogy, like hiring a watchman but staying awake to watch the watchman too.
I like that. Active citizenship, not passive.
Exactly. And Jeremy Bentham saw the whole machinery of liberal democracy elections, checks and balances as designed precisely to ensure accountability. He assumed rulers would be self-interested, so you need mechanisms to keep them in check.
John Stuart Mill is mentioned too, especially regarding liberty.
Right. From his famous work on liberty, Mill was concerned about the limits of state power over the individual. His principal power can only be used legitimately to prevent harm to others. He carved out this sphere of individual liberty thought, speech, pursuits, association, as long as it doesn't harm anyone else.
And he saw a link between this liberty and democracy.
He did. Mill believed that liberty combined with democracy created the conditions for human excellence. Representative democracy, for him, didn't just make government accountable, it made citizens better, wiser, more public-spirited.
That's a much more optimistic view of the citizen than Plato had.
It certainly is. Then the source brings in Rousseau, who had a very different perspective on accountability, rooted in his idea of popular sovereignty and the general will.
Rousseau distrusted representation, didn't he?
Deeply. He believed sovereignty always resides with the people and cannot be represented. Representatives, in his view, were merely agents, messengers, who couldn't make final decisions. The people themselves, meeting together, were the only legitimate legislative authority.
So he favored direct democracy. How did he see the government fitting in?
He made a sharp distinction. The people meeting in assembly are the legislature. The government is just the executive branch. Its job is to carry out the people's will, enforce the laws they make. The government is totally subordinate, accountable, and could be dismissed at any time by the People's Assembly.
A much more radical vision of popular power. Okay, principle 3, majority rule.
This is how decisions get made in practice within democratic bodies. Disputes are settled by voting based on the principle of political equality. One person, one vote. No special weight given based on wealth, status, religion, etc., with some basic exceptions like age or sanity. You trust the judgment of the larger number.
But the source immediately adds a caution here, leading to the next principle.
Right, because majority rule alone isn't enough. Principle 4, recognition of minority rights. This is crucial. Just because a majority decides doesn't mean they can trample on the rights of minorities, whether those are ethnic, religious, linguistic, or cultural groups.
These groups often fear the majority, right?
Right, naturally. They worry about discrimination, potentially even persecution. So the source argues legal safeguards protecting minority rights aren't restrictions on democracy. They are essential for democracy to be just and stable. They foster awareness and hopefully a climate of mutual respect.
And the final principle, constitutional government.
The idea of government by laws, not by men. It means democracy needs a framework, a constitution, established procedures, institutions to translate the majority will into action fairly and predictably. This requires, the source stresses, time, goodwill, and integrity from everyone involved.
And sticking to the rules is important, even when it's inconvenient.
Critically important. The source warns that bending or ignoring established procedures, even for seemingly good reasons, sets a terrible precedent. It can open the floodgates of corruption. So a strong tradition of respecting the Constitution and the rule of law is vital for democratic stability.
Okay, those are the guiding principles. But principles need practical tools, mechanism to actually function.
Exactly. And the source identifies these mechanisms as the practical things that really differentiate liberal democracy from authoritarian systems. Their presence or absence is the key test.
What are these core mechanisms?
The source lists 5. First, having more than one political party that can freely compete for power.
Choice, real choice.
That's the idea. Democracy tries to reconcile different interests and ideas peacefully. Having multiple parties compete offers voters genuine alternatives in policies, programs, leaders. This is why, the source argues, single-party states, even with elections, aren't democracies. There's no real competition.
Okay, what's the second mechanism?
Political offices are not confined to any privileged class. Power isn't based on birth, tradition, or wealth. It's supposed to be earned through popular support via established procedures.
Equal opportunity to hold office.
In theory, yes. All citizens should have the right to run for office if they meet basic qualifications. And office is held for limited terms. No inherited power. The source adds an interesting point here about affirmative action, though. It suggests that reserving some seats or positions for minorities or historically disadvantaged groups can actually strengthen democracy by ensuring they get representation, making the system more inclusive overall.
Interesting take. Third mechanism.
Periodic elections based on universal adult franchise. Since direct democracy is impossible now, we rely on electing representatives regularly. Universal franchise means everyone gets to vote once they reach a certain age, regardless of race, religion, sex, etc.
And how you vote matters too.
Critically, the source emphasizes the secret ballot. Voting in secret protects people from intimidation or pressure, allowing a free choice. It's a huge advance over old open voting methods. And periodic means elections happen regularly, maybe every 4 or 5 years.
So the government has a mandate, but has to keep coming back to the people.
Exactly. It forces accountability. The opposition gets its chance to make its case. Voters get to reassess.
Fourth mechanism. Protection of civil liberties. This feels huge.
The source calls it the absolute core of democracy. Freedoms like speech, thought, religion, assembly, association, freedom from arbitrary arrest. These aren't optional extras.
Why are they so central?
Because they're the tools citizens use to participate beyond just voting. They let people form groups, express views, criticize the government, access information through independent media. Without these liberties, the source says, the will of the people simply can't be formed or expressed effectively. The whole system breaks down.
Makes sense. And the fifth mechanism.
Independence of the judiciary. To protect all these rights and ensure the rule of law, the courts need to be separate from and not controlled by the executive or legislative branches.
How do you achieve that independence?
Usually through things like appointing judges based on merit, not politics, and giving them security of tenure so they can't be easily fired for unpopular decisions. An independent judiciary, able to rule impartially even against the government, builds public trust and ensures stability.
Okay, so that's the checklist. Competing parties, open access to office, regular secret ballot elections, civil liberties, independent courts. Sounds like a solid structure. But the source ends this section with a big but, doesn't it?
A very important one. It warns that just having these formal structures in place is not a guarantee that democracy will actually work as intended or achieve its goals. Especially in developing countries, the source notes, you can have all the appearances of democracy but suffer from inner distortions.
Inner distortions. I like that phrase. It suggests something's wrong beneath the surface. What kind of distortions is the source talking about?
Well, for example, multi-party competition might exist, but instead of being about different visions for society, it becomes just a power struggle between dominant elite groups, big business, wealthy landowners fighting for their own narrow interests, not the public good.
So the competition is real, but it's not serving the people.
Right. Or vested interests might deliberately cultivate a sort of feudal political culture where people vote based on loyalty or handouts, not on issues, keeping them submissive instead of empowering them.
And access to office might be technically open,
But in reality, only people from a tiny, wealthy, or well-connected class can actually afford to run or have a chance of winning. So much for equality of opportunity.
civil liberties can be distorted too.
Definitely. You might have a free press, but if it's all owned by a few big corporations, it just pushes their agenda. Freedom of speech doesn't mean much if most people are too poor, illiterate, or apathetic to actually use it effectively.
The conditions needed to exercise the right are missing for many people.
Exactly. Even an independent judiciary might exist on paper, but the source suggests judges might, perhaps unconsciously, still uphold the values and interests of the dominant class, leading to justice that isn't truly impartial.
That's a sobering reminder that the form doesn't guarantee the substance.
The key takeaway here from the source is that structure isn't enough. Democratic procedures might, over time, help raise political awareness and change attitudes, but there's no guarantee. These inner distortions can hollow out the democratic promise from within.
Okay, that leads us naturally into the next big challenge the source tackles: the inherent problems of representation in modern democracy.
Right. We've established modern democracy has to be representative because direct democracy just isn't feasible on a large scale anymore.
So the source distinguishes between direct and indirect or representative democracy again here.
Yes, it reiterates. Direct democracy, everyone participates directly, only works in tiny communities, think ancient Athens, maybe some town hall meetings today. Modern democracy, for large nations, is indirect or representative democracy, where we elect people to govern on our behalf.
This immediately raises questions. How should we choose these representatives? What kind of constituencies?
The source looks at two main ways: territorial and functional representation.
Territorial is the one we mostly know, right, based on geography?
Yes. Divide the country into geographical areas, constituencies, usually with roughly equal populations. Voters in each area elect their representatives. Simple, convenient, you know who your local MP or representative is.
But it has downsides.
The source points out it can make representatives focus too much on local issues, pork barrel politics, rather than national ones, and it assumes people in one area all have the same interests, which is rarely true. You've got workers, farmers, business people all living side by side.
Which leads to the idea of functional representation, representing people based on their job or economic role.
Exactly. Farmers elect farming reps, teachers elect education reps, and so on. The argument, pushed by groups like the Guild Socialists, was that territorial reps can't possibly understand all the different interests in their area. Functional reps would understand their specific constituents' needs better.
Sounds logical in theory, but the source gives a pretty serious warning about how it's been used in practice.
It does. It points out that, historically, functional representation has often been tried under totalitarian regimes as part of corporatism, think fascist Italy or Spain. It was used not to empower groups, but to control them, bypass real elections, and suppress class conflict. A facade, basically.
So, a good idea on paper, maybe, but historically tainted.
That's the source's caution. It notes that most democracies stick with territorial representation, though they might consult functional interest groups during policymaking.
Okay, so beyond how we divide people up to vote, there's the deeper question. What exactly is the role of the representative once elected? What are they supposed to do? This leads to different theories of representation.
Right. The source lays out four main theories about the representative's job: reactionary, conservative, liberal, and radical.
Reactionary sounds not very democratic.
It really isn't. Associated with thinkers like Hobbes, it prioritizes order and strong authority above all else. It assumes politicians are wiser and know best. The people's role: maybe express their feelings, but the rulers decide. No real public control. It's elitist to the core.
Okay, then the conservative theory, Burke and Madison.
This is seen as a bit more democratic. It allows for some public control, mainly through elections, but it's still elitist. The assumption is people choose representatives from a small, capable elite.
And once chosen, these elites use their own judgment.
Yes. Representatives should listen to constituents, but aren't bound by their instructions. They use their good sense. Accountability comes mainly at the next election. If you don't like what they did, you can vote for a different elite member.
Then the liberal theory, Locke and Jefferson. This sounds closer to what we might think of as democratic representation.
The source certainly presents it that way, calling it the true spirit of democracy for representative systems. It starts from the premise of equality. People are capable of judgment. It trusts the wisdom of the masses.
And representatives' role here.
They are agents, messengers. Their job is to faithfully translate what their constituents want into policy. They don't substitute their own judgment. According to the source, this model best fits the ideal of representative democracy.
Finally, the radical theory, Rousseau again and the New Left.
This view holds the people's wisdom in the absolute highest regard. So high, in fact, that it distrusts any representation as diluting that wisdom.
So it pushes for direct democracy.
Ideally, yes. It sees representative government as a necessary evil at best, maybe not even necessary. True democracy, for this view, is people ruling themselves directly. The source notes the New Left connection here, its anti-authoritarian stance.
How does the source assess this one?
It acknowledges its progressive claim, putting the people absolutely first. But by tending to dismiss representation altogether, it becomes impractical for large modern states. So while championing the people, it offers less of a workable model for today's reality than the liberal theory.
That's a fascinating spectrum of views on what a representative is even for. Okay, so we have the theories. Now how does the actual process of choosing them work? Elections.
The nuts and bolts. An election, simply put, is how a community chooses people to hold authority. Its key democratic purpose is ensuring government happens with the consent of the governed. It provides legitimacy.
But even dictatorships hold elections sometimes, right? As a facade.
Exactly. The source stresses the crucial test. Do voters have real alternatives? Can they actually choose between different parties or candidates with different platforms? If not, like the old Soviet system with only one candidate to approve or reject, it's not a genuine democratic election.
And the way you vote matters, too. Secret ballot again.
Absolutely critical. Voting secretly allows people to choose without fear or favor. It's fundamental for a free choice.
Okay, so people vote. But how do those votes translate into seats or winning office? This gets us into electoral systems.
Right, how you mark your choice and how those marks are counted to determine winners. The source outlines three main types: plurality, majoritarian, and proportional representation, PR.
Plurality, that's first past the post, the one used in the UK, US House, India.
Yes, very common. In single-member districts, the candidate with the most votes wins, even if they don't get over 50%. Just need more votes than anyone else.
What's the main criticism?
It can feel unfair to smaller parties. They might get lots of votes overall, but win few or no seats if their support is spread out. And the party that wins the most seats might not have won the most votes nationwide.
But proponents like it because
They argue it usually leads to a stable two-party system, offering a clear choice between government and opposition. They say it forces parties to appeal broadly and accommodate minorities to win, and that it produces strong, effective majority governments.
Okay, second type, majoritarian systems.
Here, the winner usually needs an absolute majority more than 50% of the vote. Easy with two candidates, tricky with three or more if no one hits 50% first time round.
How do they solve that?
Two main ways. One is the alternative vote, AV, also called ranked choice voting. Voters rank candidates, 1, 2, 3. If no one gets 50% of first preferences, the lowest candidate is out, and their votes go to the voters' second choices. Repeat until someone crosses 50%. Used for the Australian lower house, for example.
And the other way.
The second ballot system. If no one gets 50% in round one, you hold another election, a runoff. Sometimes it's just between the top two finishers, like the French presidency. Sometimes others above a certain threshold can compete in the second round, and then a simple plurality wins, like French assembly elections.
Does the second ballot fix the problems of the plurality system?
Not entirely, according to the source. Especially in geographical constituencies, you can still have outcomes that don't perfectly reflect overall voter preference.
Which brings us to the third type, proportional representation, PR.
This is specifically designed to make the legislature reflect the overall vote shares more accurately. It's used in multi-member constituencies, areas that elect several representatives. The goal is fair representation for minorities and majorities.
How does it work? The source mentions two main kinds.
Yes, the list system and the single transferable vote, STV. In list systems, you usually vote for a party, not a person. Parties get seats allocated in proportion to their share of the vote in that multi-member district, or nationally, using various formulas, used in places like Germany, Italy, Israel.
And STV. Sounds complicated.
It is. Voters rank candidates, 1, 2, 3, in a multi-member district. There's a quota, a target number of votes needed to win a seat. Candidates hitting the quota on first preferences are elected. Their surplus votes above the quota are transferred to voters' next preferences. Then, lowest candidates are eliminated and their votes transferred. This continues until all seats are filled, used in Ireland and Malta.
Wow. What's the big selling point of PR systems like these?
Fair representation. They allow all sorts of groups, ethnic, ideological, women-specific interests, to gain representation roughly in proportion to their support in the population. The legislature looks more like the country.
But there are downsides mentioned too.
Big ones, potentially. In deeply divided societies, PR can lead to lots of small parties, making it hard to form stable majority governments. You often get complex, sometimes fragile coalition governments.
And it might even encourage division.
That's the fear the source raises. It might incentivize parties to appeal only to narrow sectional interests rather than building broad national consensus. So the source concludes, while fairer in representation, PR might not be great for national unity or stable governance in some contexts.
A classic trade-off, it seems. Better representation versus potentially weaker government. This leads directly into the source's discussion of other ways to handle minority representation, especially in really divided places.
Right. PR helps, but it might not be enough when societies have deep historical cleavages. The source highlights two other specific devices: concurrent majority and consociational democracy.
Concurrent majority, that sounds like needing agreement from different groups.
Exactly. The source traces its origins to the U.S. 19th century North-South divide, particularly over slavery. John C. Calhoun, representing the South, which was the minority in Congress, argued that major decisions should require the concurrence, the agreement, of all major affected interests.
Meaning a minority could veto a decision.
That's the implication. If a significant minority felt its vital interests were threatened by the numerical majority, it should have the power to block the decision. Calhoun even proposed restructuring the U.S. government around this principle, though it never happened.
Does this idea still have relevance?
The source suggests the principle is still invoked. It points to the veto power in the UN Security Council as a modern example, where certain powerful actors have a kind of concurrent majority right.
Okay. The second device is consociational democracy. This sounds more structured.
It is. It's described as an elaborate set of arrangements designed specifically for societies deeply split along lines like religion, language, ethnicity, etc. Think places with multiple distinct communities living together.
What are the key features of this system? The source lists 4 principles.
Yes. The first 2 are primary. 1, executive power sharing, forming a grand coalition government that includes representatives from all the major segments of society, or reserving top jobs for different groups.
Forcing rivals to work together at the top.
Right. 2, segmental autonomy. While they cooperate on common issues, each segment retains significant control over its own internal affairs, like culture, education. If segments are geographical, this often means federalism. If not, it's non-territorial autonomy.
And the other 2 principles.
3, proportionality, allocating government jobs, funds, etc., proportionally among the different segments based on population. And 4, minority veto, giving minority segments within the coalition the power to veto decisions on issues vital to their interests as a final protection.
Are there real-world examples?
The source cites post-war Austria, Catholic Socialist Coalition, the Netherlands for a period, and Lebanon's attempt at power sharing between religious groups as examples.
And the verdict on this system, does it work?
The source says it can provide a way for deeply divided societies to maintain stability and function politically, but it adds a big if. For it to lead to genuine understanding and cooperation, the underlying divisions need to be tackled at a deeper level, not just managed through institutional fixes. So having looked at the mechanics and special arrangements, the source then asks a really fundamental question. Beyond the rules and structures, what underlying conditions are actually necessary for democracy to succeed and last?
Right. It's not just about having the right system on paper. The society itself needs to be ready, in a way.
Exactly. The source starts by referencing Tocqueville's observations about America back in the 1830s. He pointed to things like the Constitution, sure, but also the lack of a big military, relative social, and economic equality at the time, a prosperous farming economy, and crucially, the mores, the habits, customs, beliefs of the people.
But times have changed since the 1830s. The source updates this list for today.
It does. It suggests a modified list for contemporary conditions. Things like A, civilian control over the military, absolutely key. B, a greater degree of social and economic equality, acknowledging that large gaps are still a problem. C, a prosperous economy, both agricultural and industrial now. And D, a democratic culture or way of thinking among the population.
What other conditions does the source emphasize?
A few more important ones. First, national sentiment. Interestingly, the source pushes back against the old idea from J.S. Mill that you need a single, homogeneous nation. It argues many successful democracies are multinational. What's needed isn't uniformity, but a shared sense of belonging, common loyalty, shared history and future, despite differences.
Unity through shared identity as citizens, not necessarily shared ethnicity.
Precisely. Second, a spirit of toleration, called the keynote of democracy. Different groups must coexist, respecting differences. You persuade, you don't coerce. The majority respects the minority is accommodated with dignity.
Third, high moral character,
Yeah.
in both the people and the leaders.
Yes. The source warns that selfishness and opportunism lead straight to demagogy, appealing to base emotions. Morality and discipline are needed for constructive problem solving.
Fourth, widespread education.
An educated population is a huge asset. People need basic literacy to understand issues, access information, make informed judgments. The source implies a state duty to provide universal education for democracy to function well.
And finally, economic security and equality. Back to economics.
This is presented as non-negotiable. Widespread economic insecurity breeds cynicism and undermines faith in the system. Huge wealth gaps destroy the sense of shared dignity needed for equal participation. The source is blunt. Democracy without reasonable economic security and equality is basically a farce. So it's clear that democracy is demanding. It needs the right societal soil to grow in, not just the right institutional seeds.
This leads us perfectly into the final and perhaps most profound section the source explores, the idea of democracy as a way of life.
This really shifts the focus, doesn't it? Moving beyond just government structures or political processes like elections and party competition.
It's thinking about democracy as something deeper, more pervasive.
Exactly. And the source identifies the American philosopher John Dewey as the key thinker here.
What was Dewey's core idea? How did he expand the concept?
Dewey linked democracy fundamentally to how people think, communicate, and solve problems together. He famously compared the democratic method to the scientific method, a process of shared inquiry, testing ideas, learning from experience. He saw the public as a kind of community of inquirers.
So democratic institutions like free speech aren't just political tools, they're tools for collective learning and problem solving.
That's the essence of it. For Dewey, good decisions didn't come from isolated individuals. They emerged from continuous interaction. A democracy is more than a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. And also, the method of democracy is to bring conflicts out into the open where their special claims can be seen and appraised, where they can be discussed and judged.
A mode of associated living. That really captures it. It's about how we live together.
Dewey saw democracy emerging when people actively communicate, share ideas, test them out, applying that scientific spirit to public life. He felt this worked best in smaller communities where close communication was easier. Voluntary associations, local groups, these were crucial spaces for learning democratic habits.
But he saw challenges to this in modern life.
Oh, definitely. Industrialization, big cities, mobility, the sheer scale and impersonality of the modern state, all these made that kind of close-knit communicative community harder to achieve. His message, perhaps, was a call to find ways to nurture those smaller-scale interactions.
That emphasis on communication and tolerance reminds me of the Nehru quote, the source also included.
Absolutely. Nehru's saying democracy means tolerance, not merely of those who agree with us, but of those who do not agree with us. It fits perfectly with Dewey's idea of bringing disagreements out into the open for discussion, not suppression.
And if democracy is truly a way of life, the implication is huge, isn't it? It means it should apply everywhere, not just in government.
That's the radical conclusion the source draws. If it's a way of life, then you should demand democratic principles and practices everywhere, within political parties, in how businesses are run, in universities, schools, even families.
The idea being that anyone affected by a decision should have some say in it.
Precisely. Workers having a voice in management, students and teachers in educational policy, party members in party policy. It's about challenging authoritarianism wherever it exists. It doesn't mean no leadership, but decisions should involve consultation and consent from those affected.
So this final vision is democracy as an ongoing, active process of inquiry, communication, shared problem solving, demanding tolerance, and extending into all our social interactions.
It's a much richer and, frankly, much more challenging understanding than just focusing on elections and government structures.
Wow. What a journey through this source material. We've gone from the ancient Greek debates, the evolution into a liberal democracy with its principles and mechanisms, faced those tough issues of representation and minorities, looked at the essential conditions for success, and ended with this really expansive idea of democracy as a way of life.
Yeah, we've seen it's not a fixed thing. It's evolved. It has internal tensions. It depends heavily on context and citizen engagement. It definitely asks a lot more of people than systems that just demand obedience, doesn't it?
It really does. Which brings us to our final thought for you, our listeners, to maybe chew on. If this deep dive, guided by Galba's text, suggests democracy isn't just about voting or government buildings, but this demanding mode of associated living, needing constant effort, tolerance, moral character, participation in our communities, workplaces, everywhere, what does that actually mean for us day to day? What is democracy demanding of you right now?